The air in Sydney that evening was crisp, carrying the sharp, briny scent of the Pacific Ocean as it drifted into the sheltered waters of Darling Harbour. Arthur sat in the driver's seat of his 2009 Holden Commodore, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. The engine made a low, rhythmic, grinding noise, a mechanical protest that he had been ignoring for months. It was a sound he could no longer afford to silence, much like the mounting worries that weighed upon his shoulders. Beside him, Margaret stared through the windshield at the glittering skyline, her pale blue dress, purchased from a charity shop in Surrey Hills 15 years ago, smoothed meticulously over her lap. Despite the mild evening, her hands trembled, a persistent tremor that betrayed the severity of the illness she had been enduring in silence for far too long. "Are you certain about this, Arthur?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, barely audible over the distant hum of city traffic. She looked toward the entrance of the waterfront, a restaurant where the lights shimmered like diamonds against the dark surface of the harbor. Arthur reached over, covering her trembling hand with his own calloused palm. "It is Mother's Day, Margaret. You have spent 47 years giving everything to this family. Tonight, you deserve to be treated with the grace you have shown others your entire life." She did not argue. That was simply her nature. She was a woman who had weathered the storms of their life without complaint, even when Arthur had worked double shifts at the rail yards, and even now, as her own body began to fail her. Arthur helped her out of the car, watching with a heavy heart as she favored her left foot. The ulcer there had been a source of constant, dull agony for months, a dark stain of physical suffering that she attempted to hide beneath the fabric of her stockings. They walked slowly toward the entrance, the elegance of the surroundings serving as a jarring contrast to the reality of their quiet struggle. Elias, the restaurant manager, a man in his 50s with observant, kind eyes, met them at the threshold. He had been expecting them. Arthur moved slightly apart from Margaret, catching Elias's attention. With a steady hand, he pulled a thick envelope from the inner pocket of his worn sport coat. It contained $1,000 in cash, every single cent they possessed. It was the money they had desperately set aside for the rent, which was already 2 months overdue. "Elias," Arthur said, his voice low and firm, "I need you to do me a favor. Tonight, my son and his wife are taking us to dinner. When the bill arrives, please tell them it has already been settled. Do not let them know that I am the one who paid it." Elias looked at the envelope, then at Margaret, who was standing a few paces away, adjusting her scarf with shaking fingers. He then looked at the older Holden idling at the curb, its paintwork scratched and dull. A flicker of realization, perhaps even sorrow, crossed his face, but he remained the consummate professional. He took the envelope and tucked it away. "I understand, Arthur. Whatever the total, I will ensure it is handled. Happy Mother's Day to you both." Arthur felt a brief moment of relief, though it was hollow. He knew that for his son, Lachlan, this dinner was merely another obligation to be ticked off a calendar. But for Arthur, it was a final, desperate act of protection, a shield he was crafting to guard his wife from the humiliation he knew was coming. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep shades of violet and indigo, Arthur straightened his coat, masked his exhaustion, and offered his arm to Margaret. They walked into the light, prepared to face the evening ahead. The drive to Darling Harbour had been quiet, but the silence inside the car served only to amplify the noise of Arthur's memories. As he navigated the familiar streets of Sydney, his mind drifted back to a cool afternoon in 2008, when the world had felt significantly more promising. They had been living in their modest home in Parramatta then, a house with creaky floorboards and a backyard that Margaret had lovingly cultivated into a sanctuary of native ferns and shrubs. It was the same kitchen table where they had sat that day, the notary's stamp still wet on the transfer documents, signifying the end of Arthur's parents' legacy and the beginning of a new chapter for their son, Lachlan. 16 years ago, the passing of Arthur's parents had left them with a modest inheritance, $3 million Australian dollars. To Arthur and Margaret, who had spent their lives working for every cent, that sum represented the bedrock of their retirement, a guarantee that they would never be a burden to anyone. Yet, as they watched Lachlan, then 30 years old and fresh from university, pace their kitchen with the restless energy of a man who felt the world owed him greatness, Arthur had felt a surge of paternal optimism. "What do you plan to do with the inheritance, Arthur?" Margaret had asked that night, her hand resting gently on the stack of legal papers. Arthur had looked at his son, seeing not the man who stood before him, but the boy he had once carried through the bitter cold to catch a train, the boy who had once promised to build a life that would make his family proud. "We are going to give it to Lachlan," Arthur had replied, his voice devoid of hesitation. He remembered the look of stunned disbelief on his son's face, followed by a rapid, fervent justification of why he needed exactly that amount to break into the high-stakes Sydney real estate market. "You don't have to do this, Dad," Lachlan had said, though his eyes had already drifted toward the figures on the page. "It is not about having to," Arthur had told him, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Your grandparents worked their entire lives to ensure you would have opportunities we never had. They would want you to build something significant, something that lasts." Margaret had squeezed Arthur's hand, her smile radiant and full of trust. "This is your chance, Lachlan. We trust you." The notary had arrived the following day. Arthur had signed away the security of their twilight years with the steady hand of a man who believed he was investing in his own blood. There had been no doubt, no suspicion, only the pride of a father watching his son step into a larger world. They had remained in their house in Parramatta, confident that Lachlan would eventually succeed and provide for them in kind. But as the years had passed, the calls had become less frequent, the visits reduced to brief, awkward appearances during the holidays, and the $3 million invested, as Lachlan claimed, in ventures that never seemed to yield a return, had simply vanished into the abyss of his lifestyle. The grinding noise of the Holden's transmission pulled Arthur back to the present. He glanced at Margaret, who was staring out the window at the passing city lights, unaware that her husband was mentally revisiting the moment he had unknowingly traded their peace for their son's ambition. The cost of that afternoon in 2008 had been compounding daily, manifesting in the pills Margaret could not afford, the rent that was perpetually behind, and the quiet, crushing realization that the son he had empowered was the very person who had systematically hollowed out their future. He gripped the wheel, his jaw set, as the harbor lights drew closer. The past was a heavy shroud, but tonight, he would finally step out from beneath it. The interior of the waterfront was an exercise in curated luxury, where the low hum of conversation blended with the soft clinking of fine crystal. As Arthur and Margaret were led to their table, the atmosphere felt heavy, insulated by the quiet wealth of the patrons. They were tucked away in a corner, a strategic placement that rendered them almost invisible to the rest of the dining room. Shortly after they settled, the growl of a high-performance engine announced an arrival at the valet. Lachlan entered with the practiced confidence of a man who owned the space he walked in. He wore a charcoal gray suit that fit with surgical precision, his presence underscored by the discreet glow of a luxury watch. Beside him, Sophie moved with a feline grace, her designer dress shimmering under the chandeliers, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown. Her hair was perfectly styled, and her makeup was impeccable, yet it was the expression in her eyes that Arthur noted first, a thin veneer of politeness that barely concealed a profound, simmering impatience. "Mother, Dad," Lachlan said, leaning down to offer a brief, perfunctory hug that barely touched his mother's shoulders. He clapped a hand onto Arthur's back with a firm, hollow gesture of acknowledgement. "Happy Mother's Day." Margaret's face brightened instantly, the lines of physical pain around her mouth softening into a genuine, tremulous smile. "Thank you, darling. It is so wonderful to see you." Sophie offered a calculated, cool smile, her eyes darting over Margaret's thrift store dress before landing on Arthur's well-worn sport coat. "Good evening, Catherine," she said, her voice melodic but detached, intentionally using his wife's formal name to establish a distance. "I see you have kept that vintage piece for quite some time. How unique." Margaret's smile faltered, her hand instinctively brushing the fabric of her skirt. "Oh yes, I have had it for years. It has always been a favorite of mine." Sophie didn't wait for a reply, already busy scanning the room as if checking for anyone of importance who might be watching. She took her seat and immediately began navigating her phone with a manicured nail, the screen casting a pale, artificial light onto her face. Lachlan sat beside her, his own device in hand, his thumbs flying across the glass as he checked emails. Arthur watched them, a heavy stillness settling in his chest. They were present in body, yet the air around them was vacuum-sealed by their own preoccupations. For 5 long minutes, no one spoke. The waiter appeared, a young man who looked like he had been meticulously trained to anticipate every need. But he was ignored as Sophie continued her digital perusal. Arthur looked across the table at his son, the boy he had once coached on the local footy field, the man he had once trusted with his life savings, and saw a stranger. He saw the cold, efficient machinery of a life built on appearances. Beside him, Margaret stared at the flickering candle in the center of the table, her hands folded quietly in her lap, trying to bridge the yawning chasm of silence with her own hopeful patience. It was a tableau of heartbreak. A mother waiting for a crumb of genuine affection from the son she had spent her life nurturing, while he, in his tailored suit, remained utterly blind to the grace seated right in front of him. The menus were placed before them like heavy, gilded invitations to a world they could no longer afford. Arthur watched as Margaret's eyes scanned the prices, her fingers tracing the edges of the card. He saw the subtle, involuntary tightening of her jaw, a reaction to the numbers that stood as stark barriers between her hunger and her dignity. After a moment of hesitation, she spoke with a softness that made Arthur's heart ache. "I will have the French onion soup, please." It was the most affordable item on the menu, a choice dictated not by preference, but by the math of their dwindling bank account. Arthur opted for the house salad, his own hunger suppressed by the weight of the evening's orchestration. Across the table, the atmosphere was entirely different. Sophie, having finally set her phone aside, began to study the menu with the detached intensity of a strategist. "They have Pacific oysters," she announced, her tone vibrant. "Lachlan, we absolutely must order them. And the lobster tail. It is market price, but it is a special occasion, isn't it?" Lachlan did not look up, but he gave a curt, dismissive nod. "Whatever you want, Sophie." As the waiter took their orders, Arthur reached under the table to find Margaret's hand. Her fingers were unnaturally cold and trembled with a rhythmic, uneven vibration. He squeezed them firmly, a silent promise to keep her upright. He could see her shifting in her chair, the weight of her body causing a fresh twinge of pain in her left foot. The ulcer, hidden beneath her stocking, was likely throbbing, a constant, sharp reminder of the insulin she had been forced to ration for months because the rising cost of medication had outpaced their dwindling pension. Sophie leaned forward, her expression shifting into a performance of intimacy that felt entirely rehearsed. She pulled her phone from her clutch and turned it toward them, the screen displaying a grainy, grayscale image of an ultrasound. "Lachlan and I have some news," she declared, her voice projecting just enough to ensure the nearby tables could hear. "We are expecting 14 weeks. Margaret gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as tears welled in. Her eyes. "Oh, my word, a baby? Lachlan, you are going to be a father?" Lachlan offered a thin, practiced smile. "Yes, mother. We wanted to tell you in person today." Margaret's joy was visceral, a pure and unfiltered radiance that momentarily transformed the cold dining room. She reached out to take Sophie's hand, her own shaking with profound emotion. "This is a miracle. Our first grandchild." Arthur remained still, his silence an anchor in the storm of their deception. He watched Sophie, a woman who had ordered a bottle of wine more expensive than his weekly grocery bill, sip the vintage with careless ease. He recalled how Margaret had abstained from a single drop of alcohol when she carried Lachlan, and he looked at the ultrasound image, which seemed too perfect, too textbook, lacking the messy, human reality of his own memories. He felt a cold, jagged realization pierce his chest. The dinner, the announcement, the performative joy, it was all a stage, and he and Margaret were the only ones who did not know they were being used as props. Sophie wasn't looking at a grandchild. She was looking at a legacy that she intended to secure, with no regard for the woman whose own legacy was currently fading away in a corner booth. Arthur sat in a state of suspended animation, the rhythmic clinking of silverware serving as a dissonant heartbeat for the table. He watched Sophie consume her oysters with a clinical precision that bordered on greed, each one an indulgence that cost more than a day's worth of Margaret's life-sustaining medication. Beside him, Margaret's French onion soup sat untouched. The cheese on top, once molten and inviting, had congealed into a thick, rubbery skin. She was no longer looking at the food. Her gaze was locked on her son, searching his face for a flicker of the boy who had once run to her with scraped knees and bruised dreams. But Lachlan was unreachable, his attention tethered firmly to the digital world of his phone, his thumbs swiping through market trends and social media updates with a callous, mechanical grace. Arthur's mind drifted, the habit of a lifetime forcing him into a state of hypervigilance. He scanned the restaurant, his eyes moving from the chandeliers to the exits, a remnant of his years working the rail yards where safety was synonymous with survival. His gaze settled on a table a few rows away. A woman, perhaps in her mid-40s, sat alone. Her dark hair was pulled into a severe, professional knot, and she wore a plain blouse that suggested a life of quiet utility rather than luxury. She was not eating. Instead, her phone was propped against a water glass at a calculated angle, the lens pointing directly toward their booth. He recognized that posture, the focused stillness, the absence of recreational scrolling. She was recording. He felt no alarm, nor did he feel the expected surge of indignation. Instead, a strange sense of clarity washed over him, as if the universe were finally aligning to document the truth. He looked away before she could catch him observing her, focusing instead on his own right hand resting on the white linen. A jagged, silvered scar ran from his knuckles to his wrist, a mark of the night in 1994 when he had pulled a man from the wreckage of a burning warehouse in Alexandria. It was a souvenir of a life spent sacrificing himself for the safety of others. The manager, Elias, approached their table once more, his movements as fluid as the tides of the harbor. He addressed the group, but his eyes, dark and heavy with unspoken knowledge, rested exclusively on Arthur. He leaned down, his voice a low, modulated murmur. "Is there anything you require, Arthur?" He then glanced at the scar on Arthur's hand, his expression flickering with a sudden, sharp recognition. It was as if a dormant memory had been jolted awake. Elias stood there for a beat longer than protocol allowed, a silent bridge of solidarity forming between them. Arthur felt the weight of that glance. He knew that the stage was being set, not by his son's design, but by his own quiet insistence on dignity. He looked at Sophie, who was now laughing at something she had seen on her phone, and at Lachlan, who looked hollowed out by his own ambition. The mother they were celebrating today was a woman who was slowly withering away, yet they were too preoccupied with their own reflection in the glass of their wine to see the ghost sitting right in front of them. Arthur took a slow, steadying breath. He felt the folder in his jacket pocket, pressed against his ribs, a collection of cold, undeniable facts. The recording woman's phone remained steady, a silent, unblinking eye in the corner of the room, ready to bear witness to the end of a long, painful silence. The interruption came not as a shout, but as a deliberate, measured intrusion into the table's performative peace. Lachlan's phone pulsed against the table, a frantic vibration that sent a ripple of tension through his frame. He glanced at the screen, his face draining of what little warmth it had previously held. Without a word of apology to his mother or wife, he pushed his chair back with a jarring scrape and strode toward the restaurant entrance, his movements rigid with the kind of urgency that only business crises or personal failures can summon. Arthur watched his son vanish into the sea of diners, noting the way Lachlan's hands were balled into tight, white-knuckled fists. Sophie merely sighed, a sound of practiced annoyance, and turned her attention back to her wine, swirling the deep red liquid with a slow, hypnotic motion. Arthur leaned back, his own composure serving as a silent buffer against the chaos he knew was imminent. It was then that Elias returned, not with the dessert menu, but with a presence that felt significantly heavier than before. He paused at the edge of their table, his eyes once again finding Arthur's. There was an unspoken communion in that gaze, a recognition of shared history and mutual respect that transcended the sterile environment of the fine dining establishment. Elias's eyes traced the length of the scar on Arthur's hand, then flickered to the folder bulging in Arthur's breast pocket. "The manager seems very attentive, Arthur," Margaret murmured, her voice thin and tired. She did not understand the undercurrents shifting beneath the table, nor the quiet war that Arthur had been waging for the better part of a year. She only knew the comfort of Arthur's arm around her shoulder and the persistent, throbbing ache of her own body. "He is simply doing his job, Margaret," Arthur replied, his voice a steady, grounding vibration. He looked back toward the entrance, watching Lachlan pace by the reception desk. Through the glass, Arthur saw his son talking into the phone, his free hand raking through his hair in a gesture of profound desperation. It was a sight that should have stirred a father's instinct to help, but Arthur felt only a cold, detached clarity. He thought of the warehouse in Alexandria, the heat that had peeled skin from bone, and the man he had carried out, a man whose life had been measured in moments he almost didn't have. He realized that for 16 years, he had been trying to carry Lachlan out of his own moral decay, only to realize that his son had already built his house inside the fire. The woman at the corner table had not moved, but her phone was now angled differently, capturing the silhouette of Lachlan's frustration against the glittering harbor lights. The room felt as though it were holding its breath, the air thinning as the truth began to press against the boundaries of the polite society Sophie so desperately craved. Arthur didn't reach for his glass. He didn't check the time. He simply waited, his scarred hand resting firmly on the tablecloth, anchoring himself to the reality of the moment. He knew that when Lachlan returned, the facade would no longer be enough to hold the weight of the coming storm. The dinner was no longer about Mother's Day. It was about the final, inevitable accounting of a life built on neglect. Lachlan returned to the table 10 minutes later, his face pale under the soft, golden glow of the chandeliers. He did not apologize for his absence. Instead, he slumped into his chair and reached for his wine with a shaky hand, avoiding his mother's expectant gaze. The silence that followed was thick, a suffocating layer of tension that seemed to repel even the ambient noise of the restaurant. Arthur observed his son's jaw, which was clenched so tightly it seemed the bone might snap. It was the face of a man who had finally realized his house of cards was leaning, though he remained blissfully ignorant of the wind Arthur was about to unleash. "Is everything all right, Lachlan?" Margaret asked, her voice barely rising above the low murmur of the surrounding tables. She reached out, her fingers hovering near his sleeve, but she didn't quite make contact. "It is fine, Mother. Just work." Lachlan snapped, his tone sharp and dismissive. He didn't look at her. His gaze remained fixed on his steak, his knife making a precise, rhythmic scraping sound against the porcelain. Sophie flicked a dismissive hand, her eyes still glued to the glowing screen of her phone. "Derek is always calling with some sort of crisis. He is a drama queen, honestly." She took another sip of wine, clearly oblivious to the mounting unease that was beginning to ripple through their immediate vicinity. Arthur felt his patience, the hard-won endurance of a man who had spent decades waiting for the right moment to act, solidify into an icy, impenetrable resolve. He placed his fork down with a final, quiet click. Across the room, Elias stood near the bar, his gaze locked onto their table, his posture alert and waiting. The woman at the corner table, Rachel, had not moved. Her phone remained propped against her water glass, a silent sentry recording the dissolution of a family. "The check, please," Sophie called out to the passing waiter, her voice bright and imperious. She didn't look at Arthur, didn't look at Margaret, didn't look at the woman who had birthed her husband. She looked only at the exit, eager to shed the skin of this mandatory evening. The waiter, Tyler, returned within moments, carrying a small, black leather folder. He placed it in the center of the table with a practiced, solemn grace. It sat there, a stark, dark object against the pristine white linen, representing the final barrier between their performance and the truth. Sophie was the first to reach for it. She opened the folder and her eyes scanned the bill, her lips moving slightly as she tallied the costs of their indulgence. Arthur watched her reflection in the dark, polished surface of the table. He knew the numbers by heart: the oysters, the wagyu, the vintage camas, the tax, and the gratuity. He also knew that the true cost of this dinner had been paid hours ago, in a quiet, lonely exchange with Elias at the front desk. "Tyler," Sophie said, her voice clear and cutting, piercing the quiet of the room. "We will need separate checks. We are covering our own, and the others will take care of theirs." She gestured toward Arthur and Margaret with a disdainful tilt of her head. "We are not paying for her." The words hit the air like a physical blow. The silence in the restaurant deepened, turning from polite to absolute. The couple 2 tables away froze, forks suspended in midair. Arthur didn't move. He felt Margaret's hand, cold and frail, spasm in his own. He looked at his son, waiting for the defense, the protest, the simple, human decency that would reject such cruelty. But Lachlan merely nodded, a sharp, cold motion of agreement. It was the moment Arthur had feared, the moment he had anticipated, and the moment he finally realized he had nothing left to lose. He stood up, the chair legs scraping harshly against the marble floor, and prepared to reveal exactly what his son had truly cost. Arthur stood slowly, his movements deliberate and unhurried, like a man bracing himself against the rising tide. The restaurant had fallen into a hush so profound that the distant murmur of the harbor outside seemed to vanish. Tyler, the waiter, stood immobilized, his face flushed with the kind of acute discomfort that only comes from witnessing a public betrayal. Sophie's hand was still poised over the bill, her expression a mix of irritation and expectation, while Lachlan remained slouched in his chair, his eyes fixed on the tablecloth as if he could burrow into the marble beneath it. $687.42, Arthur said, his voice quiet but carrying with a resonance that reached the furthest corners of the room. He didn't raise his volume, nor did he inject his words with the venom that was currently roiling in his chest. That is the cost of this meal. It is a figure of no consequence to you, I am sure, but I know exactly what it represents. He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew the weathered folder. He laid it on the pristine white tablecloth, the frayed edges of the cardboard a stark contrast to the opulence of the setting. Every eye in the restaurant was fixed upon him now. The couple at the adjacent table, the family with their teenagers, the staff, and the silent, recording presence of the woman at the corner table. 16 years ago, Arthur continued, his gaze locking onto Lachlan, who was now forced to look up. I sat at our kitchen table in Parramatta and signed over $3 million. Every cent of the inheritance my parents left behind. I did it because I believe that a father's role is to provide the soil in which his children can grow. I didn't ask for a receipt. I didn't ask for a return on that investment. I asked only that you build a life that you would be proud to look back upon. Arthur flipped open the folder. He didn't pull out a document immediately. He simply rested his scarred hand upon the stack of papers, a silent testament to the work and the sacrifice that had shaped his life. You say you will not pay for her, he said, gesturing toward Margaret, who was now sobbing silently into her napkin. You say she is an obligation. But for 3 years, while you were navigating the high-stakes world of Sydney real estate, we were navigating the slow, brutal reality of survival. He pulled out the first document, a bank statement from 2008, the yellow highlighted transfer clearly visible. He set it down. Then, he pulled out the first of many medical invoices, the red, overdue stamp stark against the white paper. I am not here to ask for a handout, Arthur said, his voice finally hardening, an edge of tempered steel cutting through the air. I am here to show you the ledger you have been keeping, even if you were too busy to notice the math. You have spent your life calculating what you are worth, but tonight, I am going to show you exactly what you have cost us. The silence was absolute. Lachlan's face had turned a sickly, ashen gray, and Sophie's smug confidence had entirely evaporated, replaced by a frantic, darting apprehension. Arthur felt the heavy, suffocating pressure in his chest ease for the first time in months. The truth was no longer a secret he had to carry. It was a weight he was finally, mercifully, laying down upon the table. He prepared to deal the papers out, one by one, like a dealer in a game where the stakes had always been more than just money. They had been the very soul of the man who had raised them. Arthur did not rush. He treated each document like a shard of broken glass, handling it with the careful precision of a man who understood the weight of what he was revealing. He slid a stack of medical bills across the marble table, their edges fan-folded. These are the invoices for Margaret's insulin, her specialist consultations, and the emergency stays at Royal Prince Alfred Hospital, he stated, his voice a steady, rhythmic pulse. The total is $146,000. That is the debt we incurred while you were buying luxury apartments and seeking tax havens for your failed business ventures. While we were debating whether to skip meals to afford another month of her treatment, you were busy curating a life of absolute convenience. Lachlan stared at the figures. His hands, resting on the table, began to tremor uncontrollably. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat, dying in the dry, stagnant air. Sophie, however, had found a flicker of her old defiance, though it was now edged with a jagged, desperate fragility. She stood upright, her face flushing a mottled, angry crimson, her hands clutching the edges of her designer dress, as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to her identity. "This is a private matter," she hissed, her voice trembling with indignation. "You are making a vulgar spectacle of yourself, Arthur. Do you really think this will garner you any sympathy?" Arthur did not even blink. He reached into the folder one last time, his movements slowing to a deliberate crawl. "Sympathy is not what I am seeking, Sophie. I am seeking the truth." He pulled out the final 2 pages, the printed receipts for the silicone pregnancy belly and the invoice from the fake ultrasound generator. He laid them next to the medical bills, a stark juxtaposition of synthetic deception against genuine suffering. "I know about the pregnancy, Sophie. Or rather, I know about the lack of it." The restaurant, already holding its breath, seemed to experience a collective shudder. Sophie went deathly still. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking fragile and suddenly very young. The composure she had worn like armor for years finally shattered. Her eyes darted frantically toward the recording woman at the corner table, who had not stopped filming for a single second. "You think you're so righteous," Sophie screamed, her voice cracking as the facade of the polished socialite collapsed. She took a step toward Arthur, her eyes burning with a mixture of terror and self-loathing. "You don't understand. In this city, if you don't have that perfect image, that perfect life, you are absolutely nothing. I have had to use every tactic, every lie, every piece of silicone, just so we wouldn't end up like you. I was terrified of becoming a failure, of becoming just like your parents, hiding in a crumbling house in Parramatta, waiting for the world to pass us by. I did what I had to do to keep us relevant, to keep us from drowning in the mediocrity you call a life." Lachlan let out a strangled, incoherent sound, the weight of her words striking him harder than the financial evidence. He slumped forward, his forehead resting against the cool surface of the table. The image of the son Arthur had once championed was dissolving, replaced by the broken, shivering figure of a man who had finally realized his own moral bankruptcy. Sophie stood there, her chest heaving, the remnants of her composure lying in ruins. Arthur remained standing, his scarred hand hovering over the evidence of their betrayal, looking not like a victim, but like a man who had finally brought the truth into the light. In the harsh, unflinching glow of the dining room, there was no longer a place for them to hide. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound. It was a physical pressure, heavy and suffocating, as if the room itself were recoiling from the exposure of such profound malice. Sophie, now standing and trembling, tried to smooth her dress, but her fingers clawed at the air as if searching for a thread of dignity that had already frayed into nothingness. Lachlan remained collapsed, his face buried in his hands, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps that spoke of a soul finally buckling under the weight of its own neglect. It was then that the silence was shattered, not by an angry roar, but by the slow, deliberate sound of a single pair of hands coming together in applause. It started at the back of the room, from the couple who had been dining only a few tables away. The woman, eyes bright with tears, stood up, her clapping echoing like a rhythmic verdict against the walls. Within seconds, the sound swelled. It was not the hollow, polite applause of a formal event, but the raw, visceral appreciation of strangers who had just witnessed the reclamation of truth. One by one, then in a sudden, surging wave, the entire restaurant rose to its feet. 80 people, perhaps more, stood in solidarity with the older man who had dared to stand tall in the face of his own son's cruelty. Elias, the manager, stepped forward, his face wet with tears. He bypassed the weeping Lachlan and the cowering Sophie, walking directly to Arthur. He stopped, his gaze falling upon the silvered scar on Arthur's hand. "Mr. Sullivan," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know who you are. I have known since the moment you stepped into this building." He gestured toward the scar. "August 1994. The warehouse fire on Alexandria Street. My father, Roberto, was the man you pulled from the burning beam. He lived for another 25 years because you chose to run into a building that everyone else said was too dangerous. He spoke of you until his final day." Arthur felt his knees weaken. The stoic mask he had maintained all evening began to slip. He looked at Elias. then at the sea of people standing around him, their faces reflecting the compassion he had been denied by his own flesh and blood. The woman at the corner table, Rachel, had finally stopped recording. She lowered her phone, her eyes locked onto Arthur's with an expression of profound, quiet reverence. "There is no check," Elias announced to the room, his voice ringing with a new, authoritative clarity. "This meal was settled this afternoon. And from this night forward, the waterfront is a home for you, Arthur. You are not a customer. Here, you are the reason we have the right to stand at all." He reached into his jacket and pulled out the envelope Arthur had given him, pressing it back into Arthur's hand, along with a check from the restaurant for $5,000. "Take it," Elias urged, his grip firm. "My father would have had nothing if not for you. You have already paid for this 10,000 times over." As Arthur stood there, supported by the arm of his weeping wife and the collective presence of 100 strangers, he felt the icy barricade around his heart finally shatter. The applause continued, a thunderous roar of human connection that drowned out the sound of Sophie's frantic, whispered excuses and Lachlan's broken, guttural sobbing. The truth had not only been spoken, it had been vindicated. They walked toward the exit, the path parting for them as if through a hallowed crowd, while the weight of 16 years of silent suffering finally began to lift, leaving behind only the quiet, searing heat of a man who had reclaimed his life. The transition back to reality was not the cinematic triumph Arthur had expected. It was a slow, agonizing process of dismantling a life built on foundations of sand. In the weeks that followed their exit from the waterfront, the ripple effects of the viral video, uploaded by Rachel and viewed by millions, acted as an unforgiving tide, sweeping away the hollow structures Lachlan and Sophie had curated. Lachlan, stripped of his professional reputation and the illusion of his success, underwent a radical, painful metamorphosis. He sold the luxury real estate portfolio that had been hemorrhaging money for years, settled his legal obligations with the creditors Derek had betrayed him with, and walked away from the high-rise lifestyle in the city center. He moved into a modest, one-bedroom apartment in Newtown, a vibrant but unassuming suburb where the frantic energy of the corporate world faded into the hum of local life. He took a position as a project manager for a mid-sized construction firm, trading his tailored suits for sturdy work boots and high-visibility vests. The first time he stood on the active construction site, Lachlan felt the weight of his own history pressing against his chest. He stood still for a long moment, watching the veteran laborers observe him with a mixture of wariness and open suspicion. They saw a man who didn't belong, a man whose hands had never known the bite of true labor. In that quiet, heavy moment, he realized that the deep chasm he had dug was not constructed of money, but of his own blinding arrogance. Every evening, when he returned to his cramped apartment, he had to consciously stop himself from reaching for his phone to call his former associates for a lifeline. Instead, he forced himself to sit in the stillness and learn how to face the deafening silence of his own conscience. It was grueling, honest labor that left his hands calloused and his muscles aching. But for the first time since his university years, Lachlan found himself sleeping without the aid of sedatives. He made no grand declarations. He simply showed up. Every Saturday, he arrived at Arthur and Margaret's house in Parramatta, not with expensive gifts, but with groceries and a toolbox, spending his weekends repairing the rotting deck and the leaking faucets that Arthur no longer had the strength to fix. The national response to their story was equally transformative. The GoFundMe campaign, initiated by a stranger moved by the video, had surpassed all expectations, raising nearly $500,000. It was an overwhelming testament to the collective empathy of the Australian public, who saw in Arthur and Margaret's struggle a mirror to their own fears of being forgotten. With these funds, Lachlan meticulously paid off every cent of the medical debt that had been a noose around his parents' necks. He facilitated Margaret's access to the best endocrinologists at Royal Prince Alfred Hospital, and by the autumn, the ulcer that had plagued her for years was finally under control, thanks to a combination of disciplined care and the latest advancements in wound management. The process of healing, however, was not limited to the physical realm. Arthur found himself navigating a new, fragile geography of forgiveness. He and Margaret spent their afternoons in the garden, the silence between them no longer heavy with unspoken resentment, but comfortable with the presence of a man who was proving, through sweat and quiet persistence, that he was attempting to atone for his sins. Lachlan did not ask for instant absolution. He understood that trust, once shattered, could only be rebuilt piece by piece, like mortar set in cold, hard stone. He attended Margaret's appointments, took notes on her dietary requirements, and listened, truly listened, to his father's stories of the rail yards, learning the history of the man he had once deemed irrelevant. The house in Parramatta, once a tomb of shared silence, slowly began to breathe again, the air filled with the scent of coffee and the sounds of a family tentatively, cautiously, learning how to be whole once more. The following May, exactly 1 year and 1 day after the dinner that had dismantled their lives, the morning sun poured through the windows of Arthur and Margaret's home in Parramatta with a warmth that felt like a benediction. The house, now restored and steady, was filled with a quiet peace that Arthur had once thought lost to time. He stood by the kitchen window, watching the native ferns in the backyard sway gently in the breeze. Behind him, Margaret moved through the room with a renewed, steady grace. Her health stabilized and her spirit finally at rest. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape that was different, yet fundamentally whole. They arrived at Lachlan's small apartment in Newtown just after noon. The building, nestled among the tree-lined streets of the suburb, lacked the gilded arrogance of Darling Harbour, but it possessed something far more enduring, a sense of authentic living. Lachlan opened the door, his appearance modest in jeans and a plain shirt. He looked like a man who had traded the fever of ambition for the grounded reality of his own existence. There was no pretense, no luxury, only the smell of roasted chicken and rosemary wafting from a tiny kitchen, and a table set with simple, mismatched ceramics. Rachel, who had become a vital thread in the tapestry of their lives, arrived shortly after, her laughter mingling with the sunlight in the small living space. The meal was not the product of a professional kitchen, but the labor of a son who had spent his entire morning ensuring it was prepared with care. As they sat together, the conversation was not burdened by the past, but enriched by it. They spoke of small, tangible things, the progress of Arthur's garden, the success of Lachlan's current construction project, and the simple joy of having time to listen. Even as they laughed, Arthur occasionally caught Lachlan's hand drifting toward his phone, only for the younger man to pull it back and push the device aside, an involuntary habit of his former life that he was actively unlearning. The suspicion that had once defined their relationship had not vanished entirely. It had merely been replaced by a quiet, persistent effort to build something better. They never spoke of the scandal at the waterfront again. It was a silent pact shared by all four. They understood that they were building a new home upon the ruins of the past. The cracks remained, but they no longer threatened to break them. After they had cleared the plates, Lachlan placed a thick manila envelope on the table. Inside were the receipts for every medical debt, every treatment, and every cost that had once been their undoing, all stamped, paid in full. "It is done, Mom, Dad," Lachlan said, his voice quiet. "Everything is cleared. There is an investment account now, established for your future care." Arthur looked at the man his son had become, a man who had walked through the fire of his own failure and emerged with his humanity intact. He realized that the inheritance he had once worried about was never the true legacy he was meant to leave. The true legacy was this: the capacity to forgive and the humility to realize that love is a commitment to show up. As the sun began to dip behind the Sydney skyline, painting the horizon in hues of soft gold, they moved to the small patio. Arthur sat beside Margaret, her hand warm and steady in his. He looked at the son who had finally found his way home, and understood that they had not just survived, they had transcended. In that small apartment in Newtown, amidst the simple beauty of a life reclaimed, Arthur finally knew the peace of a man who had kept his promise to his family, and in doing so, had saved himself.